Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of Cloud OnAir, live webinars from Google Cloud. We host webinars daily on lots of exciting topics. My name is Shri Reddy, Customer Engineer Google Cloud, and today we'll be talking about the do's and don'ts of migrating your workloads to Google Cloud. Customers are migrating to the cloud for a variety of reasons: data center consolidation, re-innovating their business, and just getting ahead and getting more innovative with how they run their business. Making that change can be challenging, but what the goal of today's session is to break that down for you and to help you make that change with confidence. And to help me with that, joining me today are Som and James from our Google Cloud PSO team. Thank you for joining us today.
Honored to be here.
Nice to be here.
I'm super excited about diving deep into this topic because I feel like there's a lot out there, a lot of small things out there that people are not aware of when they're making this big change. So, Som, can you start us off by talking a bit about what PSO is and how do you all help customers and your role with PSO?
Absolutely, Shri. So PSO represents the professional services arm of Google Cloud. We sit under our services organization here. Basically, our mission is to help the customers get most out of the Google Cloud products, using them to their full potential and getting the most out of it, and also helping you accelerate your journey to Google Cloud Platform. We do this in 4 different ways. We bring some dedicated Google expertise to solve your business challenges. Folks like me, James, and we have a pretty large global team which will come on site, work with you to actually help you migrate or implement Google Cloud services. We equip your team to take on challenges with training and certifications. We have a whole set of training certification programs that is also kind of run by professional services team, and we'll talk about that more later in the webinar today. And we also recommend solutions based on proven methodologies and best practices. Again, we'll talk more around some of the best practices. James will particularly stress on 1 or 2 examples of what we mean. And professional services team also enables our partner ecosystem. For Google Cloud, partners are really important, and PSO is dedicated to enabling our partners. We accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in 3 different pillars, basically. Consulting / migration / implementation services. James is one of the key leaders in that team, and we'll talk more about how we kind of specifically help on some of these migrations. The second is more like the long-term success and advocacy, which is our technical account management team, which I'm a representative on. And then our third pillar is training and certification, which we'll cover later on in the short.
So once a project has been identified, you're there sitting next to the customer day in and day out, helping them through the process.
Absolutely, that's right.
I have worked with the PSO team in a lot of the accounts, and I can vouch for your expertise that you'll bring to the table. So let's get started with the do's and the don'ts.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the things we should be doing?
Yeah, let's start with the technology side. Probably the number 1 thing that we would want to do from the tech side is establish a GCP foundation. When we say foundation, we mean really everything that the app would sit on top of. Right? We tend to think of a Google Cloud project as having 3 layers: the foundation, the technology stack, and then the application sits on top of that. So the foundation piece, we're talking about identity, access management, networking, monitoring, billing, security, etc. All those things which go into making a blessed platform. And what we've seen with customers in the past is making these a very deliberate decision is extremely valuable. There are a number of things which you would need to decide early on when rolling out your technology into Google that have long-lasting implications. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that they need to be thought through. If these decisions are made kind of unintentionally, then we find ourselves in a situation 6 months to a year down the line where there are problems that have arisen, and it's really because the decisions weren't necessarily wrong, but they were made unintentionally without even necessarily realizing that they were a decision because it was the default. So what we want to do is say, at the point everything is going to be built on top of this foundation, let's get it right early. Let's think it through, let's make the decisions intentionally, and end up with a platform that we can trust and that we're happy to start migrating applications into.
And we do have a lot of best practices documented for each of these areas, right?
Absolutely, both publicly in our Google Cloud documentation. We also have, on our side, the Google professional services teams are well set up to go implement this, both From a consulting manual perspective, we also have a number of tools which make it very easy to build this out automatically. And we also have enabled our partners to do the same.
Yeah,
so we spend a lot of time training our partners and enabling them to understand what the best practices are so they can go out with Google's customers and actually implement these foundations.
Excellent. Everything is code.
Yeah.
I think key
I don't
to
even see the code
scaling
anymore.
your environment especially.
Absolutely, yeah. And yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
The larger the environment gets, the more important this becomes. So many folks will be familiar with infrastructure as code. We want to actually expand that and go beyond just the infrastructure. Everything in the cloud is an API, and so everything that you write is code to implement that API or to call that API. And so right from using Terraform or Deployment Manager to automate the provisioning of VMs and networks and all that kind of good stuff, right through to having a very robust and well thought through delivery pipeline, your CI/CD pipeline, to be able to deliver the code into that environment, which is itself defined in code.
Yeah.
Allows you to be repeatable and scalable. And we have a number of templates and examples available actually publicly in GitHub. Please go check them out, in both the professional services repo and a number of the other ones in the Google Cloud organization, which will help you get there faster.
And James, we do recommend as best practices is to automate more and more, right? I mean, that's where we are heading to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And James, a quick point on number one.
Yes.
A lot of the enterprises, the networking teams are separate, the security team is separate, and it requires some wording of, right?
Yes, absolutely. So and I think Som will talk about this a little bit as well. One of the biggest challenges we see from the people and process perspective is finding the right stakeholders at the right time to make those decisions.
Yeah, we'll cover this in the don'ts. Actually, don't do this in a vacuum, actually.
Technical debt.
Yeah,
That's
so
a big word.
It is, yeah, and a little bit of a loaded term, depending on who you're talking to. In this case, what I'm really referring to is the things that you know need to get fixed. Right. In summary, I like to think of that as a reasonably good description of technical debt. It's things that I know aren't right or were done in the quick way instead of the right way, that will at some point in the future, that may be undetermined, cause some pain. And so that time in the future can easily become the cloud migration process, because it exposes a lot of things. Right. You're effectively going in and touching. If you're going to move everything, you go in and touch every service and every application and do something to it, even if it's a very minor change. And so if you come across these technical debt issues unknowingly without having planned for them, you can find your timeline slipping very significantly, because suddenly you need to go solve some application problem which was created a decade ago that is now blocking your migration. And so we have to be very careful about identifying and avoiding it where possible. It's not always possible, and sometimes we have to bring it in. And to be fair, this can be an opportunity, right? The cloud migration can be seen as an opportunity to actually go in and fix some of those things. It's just important to have planned for it.
Okay. I think number 4 is, I feel like, the hardest question. Like, how do I know which application is cloud ready?
Yeah, especially when even the text on the slide here seems confusing.
Small,
right?
not too small, big.
There isn't necessarily a right way to do this, but there is a wrong way. And the wrong way is to do it by accident. And much like we said with the foundation, what we want to do is make this decision considerately. Consider it, think it through, and make a strategy for this. And there are basically 2 ways of doing this. You can either say, well, you know what, I actually have a very compelling event coming up. My data center lease is going to expire. My hardware is going end of life. Something like that, where I have a key date coming up that I want to migrate before, like Black Friday or a holiday period. At which point, I just need to take everything and move it rapidly. And in that case, there's a lot of benefit in doing that, because the window of pain is minimized, but the intensity may be increased. Yeah. And so the other end of that spectrum is to say, well, you know what, actually, I'm going to be a little bit more careful about this. And I don't mean that to say careful is better. In many ways, I prefer the fast approach. But I'm going to be a little bit more thoughtful about it so that I do it over time. And in that case, I'm probably going to start with one application or a few applications, then use them as the template for all the rest that come next. Enable my team, skill up the engineers who are going to be doing this, figure out the project management stuff, figure out the stakeholders, just learn how to do a migration, and then repeat the same pattern.
And James, correct me if I'm wrong, we are constantly doing this risk versus benefit versus complexity trade-off at every customer that we are working with and at every step of the way, basically.
Absolutely. There's no single answer for all customers here. And just one last piece on the start small. If you're going to take the slow approach, then starting small makes sense, but don't start too small. Start with something that's meaningful. If you just have an application which is used by 5 people and has no business criticality at all, you won't learn anything. On the other hand, if you take your core application, which is your main revenue stream, that's pretty risky.
Yeah. And training, clearly you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, training is extremely important. You'll see this point on
every slide, every part of it. Because this is really, really critical, and I think both me and James are very this is very close to our heart, because you have to learn the GCP nuances, because they are a little different than let's say other cloud providers or your on-prem operations.
Absolutely, and the number of times we've seen a project accelerate or get back on track just by training the team it's countless. Right? It's extremely effective.
So you've talked a bit about the processes also during this talk. So can you talk a bit about the process do's?
That's a great segue, Shri, and that's exactly what you're going to talk about. I think the key thing, I'll start from the top, is the vision of leadership needs to be well communicated down to the engineering teams. It needs to be tops down, but as well as bottom up. Everybody needs to be on the same page when it comes to what are we trying to achieve out of this migration, what is the timelines, what are the business critical deadlines. These things need to be communicated right from leadership to the engineering, and all the issues in the reverse way, because gaps in understanding here can lead to delays, or we have also seen leads to conflict. So just really useful to set this at the beginning and have everybody on the same page. And we talk about this over and over because this is really important, and even though it seems pretty easy, it's not so much easy to always implement. The second thing is, I'm going to talk about some traditional, again, project management stuff. Like a PMO represents a project management office, and establishing a project management office for a migration of a pretty large migration with multiple work streams is really, really important, because you need to know who are your key stakeholders. You need to know who are your key stakeholders, not only from your customer side but also from Google side. These are really important, and we need to integrate all of them into a migration PMO, as we call it. Related to that, identifying the workstream owners, right? It is really important to make sure that we identify who is responsible and who is accountable. Accountability is a really important thing, because that, if we need to push, we're getting to a timeline and we need to push, that's where, we need some help with. And so identifying the owners are really, really important. And James can vouch for that, is on the field when we are working with that, we see that some of these things are obvious, but sometimes there are gaps in implementation.
Oh, actually, I think often they're not obvious. I've come across many of the projects that we've been involved in where this is absent. And it causes huge problems, because a lot of the time you can go down a path of execution, build something, change something, migrate something, only to find that one of the key stakeholders wasn't part of that conversation. To your point earlier, if you build out the network configuration of a customer's GCP property without talking to the security team, when they hear about it, it will slow things down considerably. You may need to go back to the drawing board, may need to make changes. It's very difficult to do when that's not in place. And the PMO and the workstream owners, it solves that problem.
Okay.
On similar lines, again, I think we talked about it, is collaborate cross-functionally, but the one important one I want to call out is setting realistic migration goals. I think we have all seen that is aspiration and reality. We need to find a balance on where we are going with it, and we kind of need to check on what can be achieved within the timeline. The other two are again on the similar lines. I think the number 6 is really important, which is prioritize for risk, issues, and feature requests. What I mean by that is we need to identify what are the nice to haves versus what are the must-haves. I think sometimes, I have seen is we get too caught up in something which are more like nice-to-haves down the line you need, but that's not immediately blocking your migration. I think prioritizing for these nice-to-haves versus must-haves is really, really critical. I don't know, James, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I would just echo the same thing. One of the remits of my team is to facilitate the communication between the customer and our engineering teams.
Great.
And it's more than just facilitation, it's actually understanding the technical and engineering challenges that the customer is facing and bringing that in with a very, very deep knowledge of our platform and our system to help guide our engineering teams and our product management teams in how to change and modify the application or our platform to meet what the customer needs. And so for us to be able to know the difference between something which would be helpful down the line versus something which is stopping the customer moving the applications
real
to Google
blocker,
is incredibly important. And I'm sure you've seen this as well in your world, Shri, where understanding what the difference between, that would be great versus I absolutely must have this is critical.
Yeah. No, totally. Run into it many times. And then I guess training again, enablement plan.
Yeah, more training. Train.
I mean, again, as I said, you will find this in literally every slide or everything we say is, end of the day, as a customer, you would be successful when your engineers and your teams are enabled on GCP. And they need to know, again, the GCP nuances and some of the best practices, and the only way to achieve that is through training.
So what are some of the forums available to our customers to get trained on GCP?
So there are, Google Cloud right now offers 3 modes of training. We have instructor-led trainings or the ILT courses. That's more traditional training where an instructor will come, these are like 3 days, 4 days, 5 days courses, classroom training with like a group of people. The second form of training is what we call the self-paced training, and there are multiple courses available through Coursera for Google Cloud. So if you don't have time to invest or attend an instructor-led training, you can do self-paced training through Coursera. And the third form of training, and it's kind of related to the self-paced, is Quick Labs. Quick Labs provide the opportunity for you to actually do hands-on labs. So if you want to test out how GCP works hands-on, then Quick Lab is the easiest way to do that. So between instructor-led training, Coursera courses, and Quick Labs hands-on lab, that's kind of the portfolio of our training offerings, which we provide to our customers to enable their teams.
Yeah, and I would say, particularly for large, complex cloud migration projects, I personally particularly recommend that in-person trainings. There's value to having all of your engineers together in one place, learning this at the same time, so that when they go to do execution, they're all thinking back to a specific point in time and a specific lesson, a specific thing they learned. The self-training is invaluable. That's an absolute must, but I certainly recommend for those larger migration projects we get the inputs.
Yeah, and instructor-led also there's an aspect of collaboration. I think that's what we are referring to, and everybody's in the room, and this can be more Q&A. So, but again, if you're not able to afford that time, we have ourselves.
Yeah, I've seen customers start whiteboarding their environments, what it's going to look like on GCP.
That's
exactly. That's the best possible type of training. Please invite me. I'd love to come.
So now that we're with the do's, the don'ts, what should we not be doing? I think very important.
Absolutely.
Yes, it's in red.
We are fortunate that the Google colors lend themselves to us so well. Okay, so on the technology side, first thing is don't move the baggage. I have a colleague of mine, actually in our training team, who likes to use the analogy of moving house. And moving to the cloud is a little bit like moving house. And you've probably got a bunch of stuff hidden away in a closet or an attic somewhere that you maybe haven't touched since the last time you moved house. It might not make sense to bring that into your new house. It might, and we'll touch on a little bit more of that in a moment. But the general principle here is, if there are things which are not used and which are not valuable, the cost and the effort of moving them to the cloud probably is not worth it.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say there aren't old applications which are valuable. Lots of our customers would have decade-old applications which are still critical to their business. They're still used by internal services, or in some cases they are actually customer-facing. In those cases, you may have to move them, and I wouldn't necessarily call those baggage. Baggage is the stuff that you kind of don't really need. And so figuring out what are the things that I want to spend the time and the energy to move, even if it is only lift and shift, versus the things that it's not worthwhile to move. And one of the things that we actually do, the beginning of almost any kind of migration project that we do with a customer, is go through the list of their applications or their services, if it's broken down that way, and say, okay, for each one of these, are we going to move it? Are we going to replace it? Are we going to transform it? Or are we going to deprecate it? And in the deprecate case, we can either leave it on-prem for the rest of its natural life, or we can actually shut it down and say, you know what, the cost of operating this is no longer worth it, let's get rid of it.
And Shri, as you can see in a lot of these do's and don'ts, we are stressing on that initial planning and the assessment, because that is key. We need to invest time in this initial phases to kind of make the migration move faster in the later half of the project, basically.
Time up front doubles later on.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
All right, build a snowflake.
Yeah. Every snowflake is unique, right? Every crystal is a different shape. Obviously, we want people running on our platform to be doing innovative and new things that nobody else has done before and that are different. But what we don't really want, what's not desirable, is to do that in such a way that we're not using any of our best practices, right? We've now done many migration projects to cloud platform, and during that process, we've learned a lot. We've figured out a whole bunch of best practices. We've come up with a whole bunch of patterns and repeatable work that we know will get a good result. And so when a customer is able to leverage those best practices, we know their project is going to go well. It's proven and it's established. Anytime, and there are lots of reasons why you might want to diverge from best practices, but the further away from best practice you get, the more risk you are taking on. Because the less likely it is that somebody else has done it before, the less likely it is that somebody has learned what goes wrong in that situation. So what we're really trying to say here is don't veer away from best practices unless there's a very good reason to do so.
In your experience, do you find that customers tend to bring a lot of the best practices they've learned in other environments, and they tend to just bring it and apply it as is in GCP?
Very much so, yes. When we're dealing with customers that are coming from another cloud vendor or are coming from some kind of managed on-premises type vendor, a lot of the time they will have ideas about how something should be done in the cloud. And that might be different than our best practices for Google Cloud. So a good deal of what we do, and like this, again, training, a good deal of what we do is understanding, okay, well, trying to figure out the business reason behind a best practice that they currently have, and mapping that back to what is Google's best practice for that same business reason.
And James, maybe you can talk about an example of what we mean by a best practice in GCP.
Yeah, absolutely. So we a little bit mentioned already is in the IAM space. So for granting access to cloud resources, we strongly recommend using groups. And when I say groups, I mean Google Groups. And so there are many different ways in which you can grant access to resources. You can use service account credentials. You can grant access to individual users directly. We actually recommend instead using group membership as part of Google Groups, which can be a little bit different than some of the best practices that we see from other cloud vendors who have a slightly different model. It's not to say either's better or worse, it's just a different approach. And so a lot of the time, one of the very first sessions that we will do with a customer when we're doing one of these planning exercises, which we actually call Cloud Plan, is go through and figure out what is their identity strategy, what do they do today, and then how do we map that to Google's best practices for GCP.
So I guess number 3 comes back to mining your applications, and the elephant in the room is, what do you do with the big monolith, right?
Exactly, yeah. Now,
migrate it?
Yeah, right. It's just, so sometimes we have that application list that I said, and there's just one entry, and it just says my application. It's always a challenge. Let me first say a disclaimer, it's absolutely possible to migrate a monolith into GCP. We've seen it before, we've seen it be successful before. The reason I have it in here as a don't is because it comes back to that baggage piece. It's if you have an application that you're not proud of on premises, and you move it into a new vendor, now you have an application you're not proud of, and you don't know how to run it in the new vendor situation, which is the worst possible scenario. Training helps with that a great deal, because then you do know how to operate it, but you're still stuck with an application that you're less than proud of. So one of if there is time to do this and appetite from the customer, what we recommend is use something like the strangler pattern, where you can pull out parts of that monolith, one bit at a time, and just keep pulling out those pieces. We have a cycle that we can go through of assess, deploy, iterate, where we just figure out each part of that monolith and bring that to Google Cloud. And to your point earlier about the hybrid scenario, we leave the monolith in place and just bring out each service into GCP until eventually 90% of the application is running in, I say eventually, hopefully very quickly, 90% is running in the cloud, and then you can either shut down what's left on-prem or leave it there again to the end of its natural life.
Yeah. Migrating single points of failure.
Yeah, the most controversial in the whole thing. So what I mean by this is really specifically VMs.
Okay.
So most things in Google, especially if you're using any managed services, it's redundant,
highly available.
Exactly.
Kind of thing.
So many of these things are taken care of. Like if you use Google Cloud Load Balancer, you don't necessarily need to care about having a second instance, right? But if you have a critical part of your application that's on one virtual machine, the availability profile in GCP is very different than it is in bare metal. In bare metal, there's no live migration. if the bare metal fails, the whole thing fails, right? In a GCP world, there are live migrations, and now we talk about availability in terms of SLOs, SLAs, number of nines, minutes per year, those kind of terms, which just changes the risk profile. And so we've had customers who have depended on a specific individual VM as part of their core user flow, which has then meant when they've moved that core application, that core server into GCP, if that live migrates, then that means downtime for their application. And so it's not necessarily about leave that on-prem as much as it is come up with a strategy of how we can make it redundant in the cloud. And there are many applications, many services and options we have to make that easier. Again, it's just a case of plan for it. Don't move your application into the cloud and expect it to function exactly the same.
It goes back to the risk versus, migration speed versus benefit versus complexity. Like, it's a fine balance, and we need to have a middle path on some of these things.
And then finally, on the tech piece is don't change the plumbing while you change the app.
You have to like all the analogies.
Looks like you've moved a lot of houses.
so I should have been a contractor in my other life. What I mean here is, if you change the application and the monitoring at the same time, how do you know which one's broken?
Yeah, right.
It's very, very difficult to figure out. So what we say is do them sequentially.
Yeah.
So either change the app while you keep the monitoring the same, or change the monitoring and then change the app. And this CI/CD pipeline also plays into this. So something that we've seen be very successful in a number of our largest customers really in the last year or so, maybe a little more, is actually changing the pipeline first. So modify your CI/CD in such a way that it now has a cloud endpoint. So we create that foundation we talked about earlier, modify the pipeline to be able to deliver into that foundation. And then you can start changing your applications, and slowly on the next release cycles, the target can be GCP versus on-prem.
All right, makes sense. So, process don'ts.
Yeah, I think Shri, we kind of talked about it, so I'll go fast through this. Is don't start the migration in a vacuum.
Yeah.
This goes back to leadership vision being communicated.
It takes a
down.
team to get there, right?
Yes, and like your security team needs to know what's happening. Your network team, they all need to be in the room together when we do the first discovery scoping session to kind of talk about where we are going with that. If we only work with one group and they start planning, there is always chances that there will be downstream impact of this migration, and at that time it doesn't lead to a nice conversation basically. So please don't start the migration in a vacuum. Going back to training enablement, let us not assume that everybody knows GCP who's involved in the migration. So let's plan for training and enablement.
And don't assume it's the same as any other technology.
Yeah, and also even when it comes to training, right, it's very specific around infrastructure, our app dev, our big data and ML. So depending on how you're getting impacted on the migration, you should plan for that specific training. Another thing is, this goes back again to the aspiration versus reality, is like, don't confuse between lift and shift versus transformation. Like, we really need to plan on what is the approach we are taking. Like, are we doing a transformation? Because the effort required and the planning required for a transformative approach would be really different from a lift and shift approach. And like, James talked about the monolith and microservices, right? Like, that might be a transformation. Now, when we do that, obviously, let us plan for transformation versus planning for a lift and shift. So that's really critical. And again, last point goes back to the PMO. Don't start sometimes, I've seen is we are excited by the cloud and we want to jump onto it and start a POC and go from there. But if you are actually starting a production workload migration, don't start without defining the milestones and the deliverables and the timeline, because they are really critical for us. So in terms of a migration. So that's pretty much what some of the do and don'ts are.
So it seems like we should be planning, training.
Absolutely.
Right.
And executing. But yes, those two things, I think sometimes we jump to the execution piece and forget the other two piece. Just best practice again to plan for that.
That was great. So we have a few minutes left. Can you quickly talk about, I'm sure you'll work with a lot of customers. Can you wrap this all up with what you will actually
Absolutely.
saw?
Yeah. So this is an example of a customer we've been working with for a little over 18 months now, and basically the principle that there's kind of 5 steps to this, right? Lift and shift, or lift and what? So as you just said a moment ago, Som, we kind of figure out like how would we actually choose what we're going to do with a specific application. Second stage is, okay, data center versus cloud. Like, if we're going to move a data center to the cloud, what does that actually look like? And a lot of the time, our customers who want to get out of their data center, which is common, want to think about it as going rack by rack by rack. Like, I'm going to start with rack A and go right through rack Z, and move each of those racks to GCP. We found that approach usually, there's a way we can do it which is a little bit more powerful, which is to instead break it down by services and by applications. And we'll talk a little bit in a moment about how we've changed this journey for the future. Second piece is, the third piece is discovery and dependencies. There's a lot of internal dependencies in your average data center. Figuring out what relies on what is very difficult at the services level, at the hardware level, network level. Like, there's all sorts of intricacies in there that we needed to go through with this customer. Then we figured out a deployment strategy. Okay, like, how do we actually figure this out? We've got 2 years or whatever the timeline is for this particular project. What are the things we do first? What are the things we do later? How do we break this down into phases? Can we have a first phase, a second phase, a third phase? And then finally, what approach do we take for testing this stuff? Like, what does success look like? How do we know we've successfully migrated these workloads? And so that's kind of the way we've done a number of our customer projects. Actually, this represents a number of different customers all kind of together here. That's the kind of the strategy we've used in general. Now, the question is, how do we update that migration journey for a more kind of future-looking process with everything that we've learned from having done this over the last few years? And now, instead, it's now about saying, well, actually, let's be a lot more specific in these phases, right? And so, you want to talk a little bit about the lift and shift
I think, like, even when we talk about lift and shift, right? I mean, sometimes even like, I go back to that microservices example. Even if you are breaking up the microservices, sometimes the customer should not assume that's still a lift and shift, because that's like from monolith to microservices to a migration. So if we are doing a lift and shift, we should define what the lift and shift looks like and exactly what components are coming with it. Managed services preferred, obviously, I mean, it's not just less headache, less overhead on operations. Now, might not be the right answer for everything. Again, I do want to put that caveat, but obviously, operations in cloud is very different than operations in your on-prem data center world. So when you move to like a GKE, it's manage, like the Google SREs are going to now manage your service availability. So just a different mindset of thinking. As James said, let's take a more holistic approach to this. I mean, this is not like it's not one size fits all. So we need to look at holistically, and goes back to like, let's bring everybody in the room and talk about it.
And this is where the services versus racks discussion comes in. Like instead of thinking about making cloud fit the data center use case, it's how do you make what's in your data center fit a cloud use case? And it sounds similar, but it's a subtle distinction between how I think about my applications in terms of racks and nodes and clusters, and instead think about it in terms of services, availability, and where that management piece comes from. So it's a little bit of a change of thinking, but we found that it's extremely powerful because that's how you get the best out of the cloud.
The next item there is automate to move fast. Again,
Automation, right?
Yeah, we cannot stress the importance of how important it is. Like if you want to move fast, you have to automate. And whether it's Terraform, Deployment Manager, and all other sorts of tools out there to kind of automate deployment. And also when you are automating, also you need to be aware of certain nuances on GCP, and that's where we see is, yes, it's great to automate and it will make you move faster, but also be cognizant of the nuances on the cloud, basically.
Makes sense.
And
Absolutely.
the last point goes back to our testing approach. I think James already hit the nail on the head. Like, what kind of testing works for you? Like, do you want to test the full stack versus like an hybrid approach? Do you want to like your V1 testing when a part of the infrastructure is deployed on the cloud? Like we have to. So here we figured out and we changed our testing approach to take full stack testing approach, because again it depends on the downstream dependencies, right? I mean, the infrastructure and the network is working fine, but there is something going wrong with the application. So I think how we adjusted is we started testing full stack wherever possible, because that gives us a very holistic picture. So this is how we have kind of adjusted, and it's a sample journey on where we have kind of taken kind of a version 2 on how we approach this migration. And as I said, there's always learning in these kind of migration journeys, and we always try to kind of adjust and course correct to make the customer more successful.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
So just to wrap this up, James.
Yes.
One takeaway for the audience, the
Training.
biggest takeaway. Training.
No, I'm joking. Actually, it's planning.
Okay.
It's figuring out, like, be very thoughtful about your approach to the migration, and you will be successful in the long run.
So you want to add to that, biggest takeaway?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is plan ahead, plan for risks, and track those risks throughout the project. When we say something before and then we change up later on, like that risk sometimes get lost. So make sure that the risks are tracked, and obviously I'll end with this is training. It is key to growth and successful migration.
All right, then. That's all we had for you today. We will be back with the live Q&A, and we'll be back in less than a minute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. So we do have a question from the audience. Let's dig into it. As part of planning for a migration, how do we handle naming conventions? And I'm sure you run into that in your
Very
accounts.
much so.
Yes.
Very much so.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. Thank you. Much like many of the do's and don'ts, there is not a single right answer for this one. I wish I had the
It depends.
It depends. Yeah. I wish I had the silver bullet answer for this that says if you name your VM XYZ, you will always be successful. In reality, it will depend very much on the circumstances and the specific customer that we're working with. Having said that, there are some things that we can do to make it helpful. One of the things that I've seen work very well is if you when you're labeling these things and choosing names, choose something which is unique to GCP. So it's very unlikely that the customer has already named their on-premises resources on-premises dash VM1. This is highly unlikely, right? Unless you're very, very, very forward-thinking. What's more likely, it will be VM1 or VMOAXBYZ, something, right? So instead, what we say is, if you in the cloud, if you can use a prefix to identify GCP, that will actually help you as well. If later on you go to a hybrid approach or a multi-platform approach, if you have that naming convention in place, it will become much easier to identify which resources. Having said that, if the plan is not to go multi or hybrid at some point, then you now have a redundant moniker in your label, right? Which is why I say it depends very much. Like, you can imagine a world where if you name your platform and your resources in such a way that makes sense for the migration, but the migration is a 6-month period, and then you're in the platform for the next 5 years, now you've got that 6 months baggage in you for 5 years. So it becomes a trade-off of how much do I want to plan for mobility and portability. My own personal preference is very much, I like a situation where we can move between platforms very easily. Or how much do you want to optimize for the longer term? Like, oh yes, I'm in place and I need my labels to make sense. The key takeaway for me though is, I don't necessarily recommend what the naming convention is, but rather let's have one and let's stick to it. The number one biggest problem with a naming convention is if you use it 80% of the time. Because if you use it 80% of the time, you'll find a situation where when you're doing your troubleshooting, most things make sense. Like let's imagine you had a problem with a service, and that service was tagged with a label or a naming convention, and you said, okay, show me in my monitoring dashboard every VM which has this particular name. If you missed a VM with that name, it doesn't show in that dashboard. And now you're not actually looking in the right place to find the problem, because if it's that VM that's had the issue, then you're going to have some challenges. So being consistent is actually the most important part here.
That's true. That's very critical.
And I would also add, don't just rely on the name of the resource, use labels. Labels and tags are extremely powerful.
And James, that also helps later down if you want to do like some billing dashboards and kind of extract, like, because the labels are really important on GCP and it's a little different than other providers. Is that helps downstream?
You get a finer look.
Yeah, final look and better for reporting downstream. So.
Exactly. And think about the audience. Right? The question I'm inferring from the question here is, at some point in time, someone needs to wrap their head around the infrastructure or the services and answer a question. Try to think ahead of time what those questions would be and name them that way. So to your extent from billing, I might care, okay, for any given resource, which department is responsible for that resource? So maybe there's a label that says, okay, this VM is associated with the R&D department. This one's associated with, I don't know, finance. And so the beauty of labels is you can have many of them, right? So you can have all sorts of different axes on which you label these resources. So when you do what are effectively queries later on, it's easy for you to select out the right things.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That's all we have for you today. Thank you for tuning in. Please stay tuned for the next webinar, Ask the Expert. Thanks.
Thank you.